the title of this presentation is From Kitchen Table to Boardroom Table. And what I was trying to think about here was the kind of the journey that your vegan business needs to go on from an early stage startup through to a sort of scaled up business. Now, obviously, different businesses, that journey is going to feel different. And some businesses, naturally, you may not want to scale to kind of, if you like, boardroom table size. But I think there's some sort of themes in here. And I wanted to just step a little bit back from some of the detail. Originally, I was going to talk quite a bit today about things like GDPR and stuff like that. And there is some of that in here. But I thought, actually, let's take it up a level and talk about the strategy, because actually, once you've got the strategy in place, all the other pieces make a lot more sense to fit together. And I thought, otherwise, we'll get into a lot of detail on one particular area, but actually understanding the journey in the context of sort of systems and governance perspective is probably more helpful to people. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So we'll start by sort of just talking through, you know, what I mean by the journey. And hopefully you can see this. So in the bottom left, we've got the kitchen table, and the top right is that's where we're going. That's the boardroom table. And what I've thought about during this is really some distinct phases. Sorry, my clicking's not quite working right. That's better. So there's kind of like a launch phase where you're doing research and, you know, development of the product and perhaps a bit of market testing, but you're kind of not really fully going. And then you move from there into a startup phase. And the startup phase is obviously where you're open for business, and you're kind of growing your offering. And then you move into the scale up, which is where you start bringing more people on board and starting to really scale your product or service. And I've kind of slightly arbitrarily picked two sort of key milestones for dividing those phases. So the first one is kind of moving from launch to startup, is the point at which you actually open the business, right? Because there's some things you're going to do before you open, and there's obviously then other activities you need to do after you open. And then startup to scale up, I've thought about in the context of probably when you start hiring people. Now, there are other definitions, but, you know, and hiring might include permanent full-time members of your team, but it might include outsourcing or part-time people or volunteers, depending on the kind of organization you are. But I think, to me, those are kind of key thresholds in the growth of a business where you need to change how you do things as you go. Now, obviously, every business journey is kind of going to be unique within that, but I think that's a helpful framework for talking about the systems that you need, and I mean systems in terms of technology, but actually also the processes and stuff as well that goes around that. So what I'm going to do today is to sort of talk through how I see that journey and the things I think you need along the way at different points, which hopefully will spark some helpful thoughts. And then obviously we can do some questions at the end, which might be a bit more specific for any of you. Feel free to put things in the chat if you want to as we go, and I'll try to answer them on the fly if that's appropriate, or we'll loop back around at the end. So let's start by thinking about the systems side, the technology particularly. So one of the things right at the beginning that obviously most people, when they think about they're going to want to launch a business, it's almost the first thing now a lot of people think about is they'll need a website. They may not necessarily build it straight away, but pretty much when you say to people, what systems are you going to need in your business? Website is nearly always the first thing they mention. And obviously, therefore, that's in there. I'm not going to spend too much time talking hugely about websites, not least because we've obviously got Kaylee in the group who can talk far more about websites than I can. But it's definitely the top of the list. And then the next thing you hear people think and talk about is the social media. And again, we've got a number of people in this group that specialise in elements of social media. But I think the important thing about the two of them is it's about staking out your intellectual capital, your name. It's getting the URLs, it's getting the social media handles, and you kind of do that early, because, you know, website squatting is not as it was sort of back in the 90s, but you know, there's some fairly big brands, including Fox and McDonald's, neither of which are necessarily particularly ethical companies, both of which had their website URLs spotted in the early days of the internet by people who bought them, and then actually in both cases tried to actively sell them to the business who said, we don't really understand what this internet thing is. It kind of goes to show that times have changed, but if you're creating a new brand, it's obviously going to be important to grab those things while they're available. The next thing I think you absolutely have to have before you launch is some sort of basic office platform. Now, I use the word office there, and a lot of people immediately jump to Microsoft. Microsoft might well be the right offering, but that could include the Google G Suite, or it could include tools like OpenOffice. You need something, you need some means of being able to kind of deal with things like Word documents and Excel spreadsheets, or the equivalent Google Sheets, Google Docs, because you're going to be needing to create them. You're going to be creating business plans, you're going to be creating contracts and quotes and proposals and all sorts of other things. So you need some sort of software. Now, obviously, most people are going to have that fairly standard. What you need from it at this point is obviously relatively basic. It's kind of one or two of you starting the business, so the requirements are not massive. The next thing on the journey, though, is something that actually a lot of businesses don't think about at this stage, and people tend to think of it a lot further to the right, which is you need a CRM, because right from the point you're starting your launch activities and your R&D, whether you realize it or not, you're collecting leads. You're going to be out there talking to people, and someone's going to express an interest in what you're doing, and you're going to want to capture that somewhere. So, lots of startup phase pre-launch businesses, when you talk to them, you find they're kind of, oh, I've got a spreadsheet of names, or I've just got a task in my email, or whatever else. Don't do that. Get a CRM straight away. There's a whole load of CRMs available. You can get a very good service for free from a tool like HubSpot. And for those of you who follow my social media, you'll also know HubSpot is also one of the greenest CRM providers. They've just recently carbon offset their entire business's lifetime carbon footprint, which I think is amazing. It's a kind of tool which you need to think about as your business grows, because there are lots of different CRM options out there. HubSpot, as an example, can become highly expensive as you grow if you need certain features, and you may need to change later down the line, but have something and get one of the free ones. There are others are out there. Pipedrive's quite good as a simple one. If you're going down the Zoho route, which will get you the basic office and some social media scheduling tools and stuff. You've also got the Zoho CRM in there through Zoho One. So there's lots of different ways to tackle it at free or very low cost. Definitely get one and start systemizing how you capture leads and people who express an interest in what your new business is going to do. The next step along the journey is something which is getting more ubiquitous, but get some cloud storage. That might be as simple as having a Google Drive. If you go down the Microsoft Office route, you'll have OneDrive, but get something. Again, lots of different services available there. Lots of them have got a free option. But I have spoken to at least 2 business owners since I've been going who, in that startup phase, didn't have that in place and have had various issues down the line, broken or lost laptops or things like that. You can lose an awful lot of material. Now, as I say, it's becoming rarer because Microsoft is more and more pushing you into having OneDrive. But just because you've got it, it doesn't mean you're using it, right? So this is the problem. We've probably all got at least one or more of those cloud storage services, but actively using it for your business and making sure it's clear what's there, so that if the worst happens, you're okay. So that's kind of the absolute basics. The other thing to think about before opening is you might, and the reason this is a different colours is kind of an optional, you might need some specialist technology. So if you're going to open a cafe, you're probably going to need an EPOS system, a till system, right? So there might be other tools like that, depending on what business you're going into. You're going to need specialist software, right hardware potentially right before you open. But important to just plan for that, because you can't really open without a till. So far kind of so obvious, but as you start to move through, then there are other things you need to think about. So you might or might not need a funnel. For those who don't know what a funnel is, it's a marketing automation, and it's a means of making sure that you can put something out, whether that's on social media or anywhere else, and on autopilot, it will start to move people who are interested in that through the journey of getting towards a sales call with you. Now, not every business needs that, but if you're in a coaching consultant, any of that sort of business, you definitely need one. Professional services generally, I think you should have one. You probably don't need one if you're in retail, but actually, you know, there's some use cases where it works really well. So that's something that you should think about early after opening, because that's about reducing the friction in the sales journey. And you're going to need in this early stage, obviously, to really turbocharge sales to start to grow. The next thing that, again, I talk to businesses in that startup phase, and a lot of them haven't got because they're just doing it on a spreadsheet, is a proper accounting platform. I'm slightly disappointed that none of our vegan accountants are here today, because I know they would definitely say just get one. If you get to the end of your first financial year and you haven't got an accounting platform, you're going to have an unpleasant surprise when you come to do your accounts. It's not going to be very fun. It's probably going to be quite expensive with accounting and bookkeepers' time just getting on top of it. So get an accounting platform early on. Platforms like Xero or QuickBooks are both available with very kind of low cost entry that will help you get started. And they just keep you on track with making sure you're recording things in the way you're going to need later on. So that's really important at that stage to bring in. And then we start to move into really as the business begins to grow. So reviews become more and more important in terms of driving traffic and driving customers to you as you start to scale, because it's social proof that actually you're a good company to deal with. You need to have some sort of presence. You should be on the likes of Google My Business by this point, but actually just being on there isn't enough. You need processes and systems in place to actively start to drive traffic to reviews and get reviews and do something about it. So some of you will have seen me talk where I draw the process flow of your business, and it's a sort of a big loop that shows how reviews feed back into your marketing and sales. And I've talked there about automation around the reviews. You don't necessarily need to jump straight into automation. You definitely need to have a structure and a process in place where you're actively out there asking for reviews and testimonials as you serve clients, and you're actually then doing something with them and putting them out into the world. The other thing that often gets overlooked that by this point you should really have in place is proper backups. If you get hit with a ransomware attack or something like that, you've got no backup plan in place. If you're just on like Google G Suite or you're on Microsoft 365 or something like that and you get hit with ransomware, that's it. All your stuff is gone. So all the stuff you've built to the left there, all that collateral, you know, is gone. I know some school of thought may say pay the ransom and you get it back. You've statistically got about 10% chance if you pay the ransom of getting it back, and a 90% chance that you just not only got no data, but you're also a few £1,000s poorer. So it's not a great strategy. But the other thing is you want this in place now, because as you start moving towards a bigger business, you're going to start maybe having a few kind of contracts, subcontractors doing bits of work and things like that. You're starting just to increase the risk of just human error, overwriting vital files, things like that. So some sort of backups in place where you can actually get hold of how did this file look 24 hours ago or 2 months ago starts to become more and more important. As you scale to this size. The next step after that, but before you hire, I would argue, is to start thinking about automation. Now, automation is kind of a bit of an open-ended thing, and obviously, as most of you will know, I do quite a lot of work in automation, but don't do it when you're right at the start of launching, because all your processes are in a state of flux and you're going to be changing things left, right, and centre, and automating something that's going to change just makes more work. But as you start to get towards the point you're going to want to hire people, automation is a means to actually push that hiring point further to the right and buy yourself more time, because hiring people is going to be expensive. As soon as you start hiring people, you're reducing your margins, right? So if you can delay it a bit until the business is a bit more established, that's going to be helpful. But also it forces you into the discipline of thinking about processes. So whether you're automating or whether you're hiring people into your business to do it, at this point, you're starting to think about how to do something repeatably, which means that you'll get more efficiency in the business as you scale. And there's no point in scaling something inefficient. You'll just get more inefficiency. So finally, the last thing that you start to get to around about the point of hiring is you start thinking, actually, I probably need some hardware as well. Up to this point, you might have been running on a maybe it's a personal laptop or whatever else. But there comes a point when you start hiring people, you need to start thinking about hardware. And that's not just a question of I'm going to go to PC World and buy a computer. This is starting to think about actually how are you going to manage your hardware? How are you going to make sure that if you've got a laptop out to someone who's home-based, that they're actually applying the necessary security updates to it, and actually you can track it, and that you know that where it is and when they bring it back, or if it gets lost or stolen, you can remotely disable it, and all of those sorts of things. So there's a bit more to it than just buying the kit, but you need to start to think about that as you scale. Once you start bringing people on board, you do need some more advanced office tools, and I would say this is the point at which really, if you're on anything that's not Microsoft, just go to Microsoft. There's a reason that basically every single big company and government in the world uses Microsoft, which is it's scalable and it's secure. And I would also say, having done quite a bit of work looking into it, the Microsoft kind of cloud environment is probably the greenest of the three big ones, with Google coming in as a sort of reasonably close second, and we won't talk about Amazon, but it is definitely something you start to need, because you need to be able to share documents. You need to have the right security configurations to make sure that only certain people can see documents. You don't want your Kickstart coming in on day one and being able to read, copy, delete, whatever your business strategy for the next 5 years. That's not going to be a good solution. So you need to have more advanced features. So that's the point at which, if you've been running on OpenOffice on your local computer, or you've been running on Google Cloud, G Suite, then just maybe start thinking about actually getting to a more robust, resilient, and scalable platform. And that brings me on to security more broadly, and a help desk. You need to actually have a bit more capability as you grow and you start onboarding people, to actually make sure that they can't inadvertently or otherwise do the wrong thing. But also, you don't want to have to be their help desk every time they can't work their computer. You want to be able to bring people into your business that bring the unique skills they've got, without the fact that you need them to use a particular bit of software being a big burden. So having some means of starting to actually give those people somewhere to go when they have a problem with accessing the services. By this time, we're probably at kind of 10, 15 people in the business, but you need to start to do that, because otherwise you end up spending a lot of time managing that detail within the business instead of really driving it forward. And then finally, as you really start to scale, you need to start thinking bigger. You can't have your finger on every single thing happening in the business every single day. You might manage that up to 15 to 20 people, but beyond that you shouldn't, and you shouldn't try to, because you will end up micromanaging everything. You need to think differently about how you start to manage, and that's why in bigger businesses you'll see a lot more around reporting and dashboards and those sorts of tools, and those are things that you're going to need at the end game, when you get to that size. The point really of laying this out like this, so is you can start to see, think ahead and think, well, actually, what I've got when I start, where do I need to get to? You don't need all the things at the end on day one. They're a burden, don't buy them all. But also don't paint yourself into a corner where you can't scale those things out for your business. Then the other side of the coin, if that's the technology, is the governance. And this mostly, in the current state of things, is nearly all related in some form to GDPR, but it's worth understanding. So there are certain things that GDPR says you have to have around data and systems. So the first thing, and by the way, GDPR, anyone that's thinking, well, post-Brexit, why do we care? GDPR is implemented in UK law under the Data Protection Act 2018, so it's UK law in that sense. And for those of us in the UK, operating in the UK, that's what we have to comply with. But it aligns to GDPR if you're operating obviously into the EU, or if you're in the EU, you will have to comply with the local implementation of GDPR, which should be broadly the same. But more importantly, GDPR is being used now as a blueprint. So if you want to operate in California, they've just passed a whole load of data protection legislation that's basically like GDPR. The Canadian data protection regulations are now very similar to GDPR, and most recently Brazil is now looking to adopt GDPR as a blueprint. So it is becoming the sort of de facto global standard. There's a reason that US companies all have to be GDPR compliant, and that's the fact that on the internet these days you can't know your visitors are not from anywhere in Europe, so you kind of have to do it. First thing you have to do if you're in the UK, and this does vary locally, in the UK, you must have an ICO, Information Commissioner's Office registration. It is not optional. If you run a business, you must have it, unless you can prove that you are handling no personal data whatsoever, and that includes personal data on customers, personal data on employees, personal data from suppliers, basically any data that includes identifiable individuals. I'm struggling to think of a business, even the local corner shop, that does not need ICO registration. Arguably, if you're running a solo retail business where you never collect any customers' details and you never collect any suppliers' details, and you have no staff, you probably get away with it. But that's about the only case I can see. So you have to have it. You have to re-register that every year. It costs about £40. The fine for not having it is £4,000. So it shouldn't really be too difficult a business case to convince yourself to do it. The interesting thing is that historically it's not really been enforced in the UK, but in these times of reforming tax revenues, I think it's now being seen as an opportunity to generate some more. And as of September, the number of prosecutions has gone right up. So definitely look at that. You must also have a GDPR compliant privacy policy. If you don't have a GDPR compliant privacy policy, you're in breach of Data Protection Act 2018, and that needs to be available to customers, should be accessible via your website. So you do need that, but you also need to have a data breach policy. You're also required under GDPR to have that. So your policy that states what you will do in the event of a data breach. And there are certain requirements. You must report data breaches to the Information Commissioner's Office within 24 hours. And there are certain bits of information you must record. So you need to have a policy. Every business is required to have one. And you must also have a data breach register, which is a template that you will fill out in the event of a data breach, covering broadly the scope of what the breach was, what records were breached, what the risk was, and the mitigation actions that you're going to undertake. So you must have these things. A remarkably large number of businesses will say, I'm GDPR compliant, and we haven't got them. You'll be pleased to know the list goes on. You must also, to be GDPR compliant, have adequate data access controls. You're required to make sure your data is properly secured. So it means strong passwords, it means encryption, it means not leaving your data printed out on desks. It means not leaving your data on an unsecured drive on a laptop. It means making sure that it is all protected. And that's where, again, the cloud services start to be your friend, because in order to access data on a cloud service, you need to be able to log in, and they all have strong multi-factor authentication now. So actually using those services will help you to be more compliant. The last thing that you need to have in terms of policies is a data retention policy, which is a policy around when you are going to retain the data, when you are going to delete the data, you need to have that in place, and then obviously you'll need to act on it. So you might say, I delete all customer data after 12 months after they cease to be a customer. That might be a valid thing to say in your policy, in which case you need to make sure that you have a process to do it. This needs to comply with the principle of not holding excess data, minimise what you have, and do not keep it beyond the purpose for which it was given. So you need to have that enshrined in a data retention policy. And you also need a template for a data privacy impact assessment. And the data privacy impact assessment is an assessment you have to do in your business to be compliant with Data Protection Act or GDPR every time you make a change. Now, it's not specific what they mean by a change, but you need to have one so that when you change anything in the way your business operates, and maybe you're moving IT systems or you're changing processes, you will fill out a data privacy impact assessment. It doesn't need to be long, but it needs to be a template that you've got in your business that you can fill out to indicate that you've thought about the impact of this change on personal data and the privacy and security of it. You've got to have all of that before you launch, basically, so that's fun. but it kind of doesn't stop there. So depending on the type of business and type of processing you've got, you might have to nominate a data protection officer if you have certain statutory requirements. For most of us, we will not have to do this. It might be an issue potentially for someone like you, Sam, because obviously you're dealing with client data. You need to at least look at that. You must have had sight of your suppliers' ICO certifications if they are acting as data processors for you, which means if they are touching any of your data. So in practical terms, what that means is if you're using a VA like Sam's services, you should make sure you've seen the ICO registration, and having seen Sam's, I can confirm it is up to date. Similarly, your accountant, your bookkeeper, those are both people who you should have, because they could be looking at suppliers' details, which could include personal information, and certainly will include personal information, so we'll have contact details, may also include payroll information. So you should certainly look at those. Anybody else who is a supplier to you who could be touching your data. So, you know, it might be something, Kaylee, that you guys get asked for example, where you're accessing people's websites, and obviously some of those sites will be capturing leads or things like that. So I think if you're a supplier, you should expect to be asked for it, and perhaps even proactively offer it. And if you're in any other business, you should be actively asking for it. Again, a lot of businesses don't hold this. Again, this is an area that prosecutions have started to go up radically since the 1st of September. And again, there's a £4,000 fine for not being able to produce them within, I believe it's 24 hours of request from the Information Commission's office. It's not long. Yeah, Matali, if you've had the letter about registering, do it. All limited companies, they are now going through mailing people about registration. They've obviously can get that list from Companies House, so they know who everyone is, and they can compare it and see who's not registered, and they're doing that. Sole traders, they're not quite there. And in fact, the reason they're not quite there is the only way you can really detect a sole trader is to go and get the tax records from HMRC. So the Information Commissioner's office went to them and said, can we have the tax records of sole traders so that we know who hasn't registered? Because the registration rate in the UK is actually only about 20% right now. The beauty of this story is that HMRC basically said, bugger off, under GDPR, you don't have any rights to see that data, because neither of them are actually directly parts of the government. They're both separate agencies in a legal sense. So they are, at the moment, there is legislation being drafted that will allow the sharing of that data between HMRC and the Information Commissioner's office, specifically so that they can start doing that. So even if you're a sole trader, get your skates on, get registered. It's just not worth the risk. I got slightly sidetracked, but somewhere along this route, talking about governance, you need to start getting documented processes in place, because actually before you start hiring people, you need to have repeatable ways of doing all sorts of things in your business, not just the things that you're legally required to for GDPR, but actually you should have repeatable processes in place. And you should also start at this point to think about a systems roadmap. So you start to understand what you're going to want to do with your technology as you go forward, because you know the technology that you're going to want to move to in the future, you want to know that actually you've planned it out. And as the business grows, it obviously becomes incrementally more expensive and more disruptive to change technologies. So have a roadmap at this point before you start hiring people and bringing them on board, and then you've got the cost of retraining as well as the technical work to move things around. So this is the time to start thinking about that. You don't have to be a slave to a roadmap because the technology is moving fast, but if you don't have a rough idea of where you think your tech is going to go, you will get yourself into trouble down the line. But back to GDPR, because I feel we've done enough of that. You may at this point also need to have an EU agent if you're operating in the EU. And there is a €20,000 fine for not having one of those. And conversely, if you're in the EU and operating in the UK, you'll need a UK agent. And similarly, there's a €20,000 fine for not having one of those. And that's a legally nominated representative, either in the UK or the EU, depending on which way around you're going and where you are. You can obviously have that as a member of your business if your business has got people on board. but they need to be nominated properly to do it. Once you start hiring, you also should have a register to show how your people that you're onboarding are being trained on all the things in red on the left, because it's something that the ICO will expect to see, that all of your staff understand the policies and the processes. And again, they can request that at fairly short notice. So you should have that training register in place and be able to demonstrate it. It's the reason that large companies do mandatory training. You also need a proper process around data breaches, because again, you don't want that to be reliant on, if there's a data breach, they kind of try and get hold of you and see what you want to do about it. It needs to be an established standard process, and the ICO will expect to see that. Before you start doing the reporting we talked about, on the IT side, you should have a data dictionary, because if you report on the wrong data, or you don't know whether you're reporting on the right data, reporting is misleading at best and useless at worst, or possibly the other way around. But you're not going to get the right business decisions made from it because the data is wrong. And finally, the last thing you need to have once you've got people on board is an established process for data subject access requests. And this is the process by which, under GDPR, anyone can come to your business at any time by any means they want and ask for all of their personal data, and you've got 28 days to provide it. Now, once you've got people in your business, if they don't understand that, what you start to see is them say, oh no, we can't do that, can't have that. That's an immediate breach, and you're straight in for very large fines at that point. So you need to have an established process. Again, the ICO would expect to see it, but just frankly, for your own self-preservation at that stage, you need to have one, so that all of your people understand the legal obligations in relation to data. So that's my kind of governance roadmap to go alongside the systems one. Hopefully you've all found that useful, and of course you can all tick everything on the list, or not. I mean, my sort of final thought on this is make the journey as easy as possible. Do the governance and the systems at the same time and hand in hand with your business strategy. It just works better to deliver them both together. Don't sort of go, I'll do one and then I'll do the other. Think it through, plan ahead, understand what you need first and act second. Don't just rush off and buy some bit of technology or bung in some policy that maybe isn't a good fit for your business. Understand what you need first. And I go back ultimately to the thing I always say with all digital transformation: it always needs to start with people, then it needs to go to process, and technology is the last bit on the journey.